Tonight, we're taking a quiet walk back in time, not through the bustling halls of castles or into the smoky taverns of the nobility, but along the well-trodden dirt paths of medieval villages, past the crumbling fence posts, past the sheepfolds, and into the little homes where the people who worked the hardest lived the simplest lives, and more specifically, into their kitchens, if you could even call them that. Because this is not the story of kings or knights. This is the story of peasants. I'm not the kind from fairy tales or children's books where everyone somehow always has a loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese. No. Tonight, we'll settle into the murky, misunderstood world of what medieval peasants really ate. Before we slip into their world, though, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, back to our sleepy journey. Imagine, it's early evening in a 13th century village. The air smells faintly of smoke, and you can hear the soft creaking of wooden doors being shut for the night. A thin fog hugs the thatched rooftops. Inside a humble wattle and daub cottage, a woman is stirring something over a fire. It's not stew. Not as we think of it. More like a grayish mush. Light potassium. Barley gruel, maybe. She lifts the spoon, blows on it, and tastes. It's bland, but it's warm. Her children wait patiently, with rough wooden bowls. This was dinner. Not for one night, but for most nights. We often like to think of the medieval world in flavors: sweet honey mead, hot roasted meats, fresh loaves of bread. But for peasants, the diet was repetitive, seasonal, and heavily dictated by survival, not satisfaction. And many of the things we assume they ate, cheese, bread, fruit, were luxuries far more rare than modern fiction suggests. And yet, there's something quietly beautiful about it. The way peasants made do with what they had, the slow cooking over coals, the shared bowls, the use of every last scrap of food. It was a rhythm of life that, while harsh, had its own rituals, its own flavor of intimacy, or of resourcefulness, of resilience. So settle in, pull the blanket up a little closer, let the fire crackle, and let's talk about what medieval peasants really ate, and why. Most nights, it had nothing to do with cheese. Let's begin by breaking the myth, because it's everywhere. From medieval films to modern Renaissance fairs, the poor peasant is always shown holding a crusty brown loaf and a firm wedge of cheese. A simple lunch under the sun. A humble, honest meal. But here's the thing. That image is largely a fantasy. Not because peasants didn't eat bread. They did, though not the kind you'd willingly buy today. And not because cheese didn't exist, but because both of these things, especially together, were luxuries. Let's start with the bread. Yes, bread was technically a staple of the medieval diet, but the bread a peasant ate was nothing like the soft, fluffy white loaves in your pantry. It was often coarse, dense, and made with rye, barley, or even mashed beans and acorns. Because wheat, the grain used for better bread, was hard to grow and often monopolized by landowners. What a peasant ate might be more akin to a grainy brick, not something to bite into eagerly, but rather to soften in soup or soak in water and vinegar to make it edible. And cheese, or that required milk, and milk required cows or goats, which for many peasants were not readily available. If they did have access to milk, it was often prioritized for the landowner's table. Cheesemaking also took time, salt, and some equipment, not to mention the precious resource of rennet, often obtained from animal stomachs. So even when peasants made cheese, it was typically fresh, soft, quickly spoiled, and eaten immediately, not the hardened, aged varieties you see in museum displays or fairy tale illustrations. So if not bread and cheese, then what? Well, that's where it gets interesting, because what medieval peasants ate was deeply tied to season, region, social rank, church restrictions, and weather. It was built around survival, improvisation, and community resourcefulness. Many days were meatless, not by choice, but by necessity. Church calendars dictated fasting days, often including every Friday, Lent, and other holy periods, meaning almost 1/3 of the year was spent abstaining from meat, dairy, and eggs. Add to this the reality of food preservation challenges. No refrigeration, of course, and you begin to understand why most meals were plant-based, soupy, and boiled. Soups, stews, gruels, and pottages. These were the real staples, and that's where we're headed next. We'll walk you through the smoky kitchens and muddy garden plots of medieval peasants. We'll sit beside their fires and listen to the bubbling of pots filled with nettles, onions, beans, and maybe, if the season and the Lord were kind, a sliver of salted pork rind. We'll see how food was not only nourishment, but also a kind of quiet language, a measure of the year, a map of power, a rhythm of hope and hunger. Because in the world of medieval peasants, eating was not a pastime, it was a daily negotiation with fate. Let's begin tonight with the most humble of pots. Not silver, not even iron, sometimes. Just a soot-blackened cauldron, hanging gently over glowing coals. Inside, something bubbles. It's thick, brownish, earthy. A stew? A porridge? Something in between? This is pottage, and it was the beating heart of nearly every medieval peasant's meal. You see, in the peasant's world, food wasn't served in courses. It didn't arrive on platters or gleaming plates. It came in one pot, one bowl, shared, reheated, stretched, survived. Pottage wasn't just dinner. It was dinner yesterday. It would be dinner tomorrow. It was always there, on the edge of the fire, simmering, soft, persistent, familiar. At its core, pottage was simple. Start with water. Add whatever grain you had, barley, maybe oats, sometimes cracked rye. Toss in chopped leeks or onions pulled from the garden, a handful of wild greens, dandelion leaves, nettles, sorrel if you could find it. Then, you stirred and waited. This pot was never emptied. It was added to throughout the day, thickened or thinned, always evolving. If you had a bone, you boiled it, not for the meat, because there wasn't any left, but for the memory of flavor. Meat was rare, so rare that if you had even the smallest bit of bacon fat or a rind, it was saved like gold, dropped into the pottage, stirred carefully, then fished out again to be used the next day. Imagine now, a mother tending the pot, bare feet on packed earth, her hands blackened from the fire. She stirs with a long wooden paddle, watching as the oats swell and the broth thickens. It smells of garlic and smoke, and something bitter, maybe wild turnip greens. Her children sit close, clutching rough wooden bowls, eyes sleepy, hair tangled. This was dinner, and it had no recipe. That's what made pottage so powerful. It wasn't about what it contained, it was about what you could spare. One family's pottage might have lentils, another, dried peas, another, the last carrot from last summer's harvest. And in winter, the pot grew thinner, maybe just water and onions, maybe nothing at all except hope and heat. They called it stretching the pot, and they were experts. Bread crusts were soaked in it, stale loaves softened until edible. Even yesterday's gruel became today's base. Nothing was wasted, because wasting food was a luxury, and peasants didn't live in luxury. They lived in the shadow of hunger. Still, there was care. There was rhythm in the stirring, a quiet pride in seasoning it just right, maybe with wild thyme if it hadn't gone bitter, a small joy when someone offered a beet from their garden, or a pinch of salt saved for feast days. Pottage wasn't glamorous, but it was sacred. It warmed the belly. It kept the weak from fading. It gathered the family, every dusk, around a shared bowl of steam and silence. The tools were few. A single iron pot, blackened by years of fire. One knife, passed from hand to hand. Wooden spoons, hand-carved, with worn handles and a shine from years of mouths. The bowls were made of wood or clay, some cracked, some chipped, but still good, still strong enough to hold another scoop of survival. Children were fed first, usually, then elders, then everyone else, not because anyone said so, but because that's just how it was done. It was known. unspoken, repeated, loved. Now and then, someone might sneak in a little treat, a dash of vinegar to sharpen the taste, a sliver of smoked herring, carefully hidden in a cloth and shared among six. And when there was truly nothing, they boiled bark or roasted acorns, soaked them to remove bitterness, then mashed them into the broth. Desperate? Yes, but smart. Peasants weren't stupid. They were chemists without knowing it, botanists without the title, survivors without complaint. Even food laws shaped the pot. The church banned meat on Fridays and during Lent and other holy days. That meant nearly a third of the year was meatless. No butter, no eggs, no cheese. So they adapted. They used almond paste to make mock milk. They thickened soups with ground beans. They flavored broth with salted herbs. Every fast day became a creative challenge. And food wasn't just eaten, it was remembered. The day someone brought mushrooms, the day the bread didn't rise, the time a neighbor brought duck fat to flavor the whole pot, just once, after a good hunt. These things were talked about, quietly, around the hearth. Stories built around steam and spoons, and soft, repetitive chewing. Pottage wasn't delicious, but it was dependable. And sometimes, dependable is better. It didn't sing on the tongue, but it filled the space inside, where hunger used to echo. It let children sleep through the night. It let mothers rest without worry. It let old men dream of fields instead of famine. So when we ask, what did medieval peasants really eat? We have to look past the bread and cheese myths. We have to look into the blackened pot, where barley swells, garlic simmers, and hands stir with love and survival. Because food wasn't just nourishment. It was an anchor, a tradition, a prayer, and tomorrow it would be stirred again. Warm, simple, enough. Let's step outside for a moment, beyond the fire, beyond the walls of packed earth and thatch, out into the chill air, where the real work of feeding a medieval peasant family began. It wasn't in markets, it wasn't in granaries. It was here, on a narrow patch of land behind the cottage, marked by bent wooden stakes and thin rope. This was the peasant's garden, and it was nothing short of life or death. They called it the croft, a small personal space set aside for growing food. Not decorative, not leisurely, functional, precise, desperately tended. In spring, it was a hopeful mess, shoots pushing through the frost-bitten soil, rows of onions, leeks, parsnips, a patch of cabbages curling like fists. By summer, it was a feast of green until pests arrived. Then it became a battleground. Peasants didn't farm for flavor. They farmed for calories. Each seed planted was a tiny wager. Will the weather hold? Will the rain come at the right time? Will the Lord demand a portion? Will thieves or pigs find it before we do? The croft was small, often no larger than your living room, but it was packed. Every inch mattered. Beets and turnips in the back, for their long roots, cabbage and kale in the middle, hearty and reliable, onions and leeks at the front, to grab quickly for cooking, and scattered among them, herbs, not for seasoning, but for medicine. Because every garden in the medieval world was also a pharmacy. Yarrow for fevers, chamomile for sleep, mint to soothe the stomach, and garlic for everything. You couldn't afford to visit a healer, so you grew one. And if a plant could feed you and heal you, even better. But vegetables were just the start. Peasants foraged constantly, before breakfast, after work, during prayer. They knew the woods. They knew the fields, not by map, but by memory. They found nettles before they stung. They gathered mushrooms, risking poison for protein. They picked berries, not for dessert, but for preservation. Berries meant syrup. Syrup meant winter medicine. Winter medicine meant surviving the flu. They collected wild garlic, dock leaves, cleavers, and even acorns. Yes, acorns, soaked in water for days to remove the bitterness. Then dried, ground, mixed with grain. The result wasn't tasty, but it was edible. And edible was everything. Most homes kept chickens if they were lucky. Not for meat, that was too valuable. But for eggs, occasional, precious eggs. And sometimes, just sometimes, a goat. Goats were the poor man's cow. Easier to feed, easier to shelter. They gave milk, thin, sour, but real. With that milk, a family might attempt cheese, but it spoiled quickly. So more often, it became soup, or a drink, or it was traded. Let's walk back to the cottage now. A girl is standing in the doorway. She holds a basket lined with leaves. Inside, 3 onions, a twisted carrot, and some herbs. She hands it to her mother. No words needed. The mother nods and adds it to the pot. This was the rhythm. Each member of the family knew their part. The father turned the soil. The mother planted. The children gathered weeds, both the ones to eat and the ones to burn. And yes, they grew weeds on purpose. Fat hen, good King Henry, shepherd's purse, all edible, all forgotten now. But back then they were known, loved even, tended like any other crop. In famine years, it was these weeds that saved lives. The church had rules about food too. Tithes had to be paid, sometimes in grain, sometimes in produce. The lord of the manor expected his share as well. So even your own vegetables weren't fully your own. That meant planning carefully, hiding what you could, bartering when necessary. If you had too many leeks, trade for beans. Too much cabbage, salt it, ferment it, or give it to a neighbor who might return the favor with a rabbit. In a world with no money, food was currency. A sprig of thyme could buy goodwill. A head of garlic might buy help mending a roof. A basket of greens could earn a favor to be collected months later. The garden was more than a plot of land. It was a quiet rebellion against the Lord, against the famine, against the cold. It said, I can survive, I can feed my own, I can bend the earth to give, just a little more. And when winter came, they preserved what they could, turnips in pits, beans hung from rafters, onions braided and dried, cabbage turned into sour, tangy slaw, not for taste, but for health, to fight scurvy, to stay strong, to make it to spring. In some homes, root cellars were dug. In others, dried leaves lined boxes to keep food cool. Nothing was thrown out. Even the water from boiling cabbage was soup. Waste was unthinkable. Tonight, as we rest, imagine that garden under starlight, empty now, sleeping, frost creeping in around the edges. But come spring, it will bloom again, not with roses, not with lilies, but with life, with food, with medicine, with quiet defiance, because peasants didn't just eat what they were given. They grew what they needed. They found what was hidden. They made survival taste like determination. Let's talk about bread, because when most people imagine the diet of medieval peasants, they picture one thing, a rustic brown loaf, tucked under the arm, maybe a wedge of cheese to go with it. Simple, satisfying, iconic. But in truth, bread was not simple, and for the medieval peasant, it wasn't always satisfying. In fact, it wasn't even always bread. Bread in the medieval world came in layers, not of dough, but of class. The rich ate wheat. The poor ate whatever they could grind. White bread, that was for nobles. Soft, risen loaves, for monasteries. As for peasants, they made do with horse bread. Hard, flat, dense, baked with ground peas, beans, oats, rye, and sometimes bark. Yes, tree bark, ground into a powder and used as filler. Let's enter a peasant's kitchen on baking day. It's quiet, except for the thud of kneading. A young boy turns the hand quern, grinding grain into flour. The flour is gray, speckled, lumpy. It smells earthy, almost sour. It's not just wheat. It's bits of everything. Acorns, lentils, leftover gruel. Sometimes even dirt makes its way in, not on purpose, but because cleanliness wasn't guaranteed. Once the flour is ready, it's mixed with water and salt, if they have any. No yeast. That's a luxury. Instead, they might leave the dough to sit in a warm corner, hoping for wild fermentation. Or they skip rising altogether. The result? A thick, chewy flatbread, blackened at the edges, brittle in winter, molding in summer. But it filled the belly, and for the peasant, that was all that mattered. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they used sourdough starter, passed down through generations like treasure, a living culture, fed and protected. And when it died, it was mourned, because without it, bread became a brick. Now here's something people often forget. Peasants didn't usually have ovens. Building one required clay, bricks, space and permission from the Lord. So what did they do? They baked on hearthstones, flat slabs placed directly over the fire, or they took their dough to the communal bakehouse. Once a week, maybe twice, the village bake oven was fired. Families brought their loaves, marked with a symbol so they wouldn't get mixed up, a cross, a notch, a twist of dough. Each loaf had its maker's identity pressed into it, and then they waited all day, watching, hoping their bread didn't burn or vanish. The bakehouse itself was smoky, hot, and closely watched. The baker might charge a fee in bread, 1 loaf for every dozen, a heavy cost, but cheaper than building your own. And when grain was scarce, bread disappeared. In famine years, there are records of peasants making bread from roots, sawdust, even ground bones. They called it famine bread. It didn't nourish, but it tricked the stomach into silence. Some loaves were so coarse, so rough with husk and stone, they wore down teeth. Chronic dental pain was common. But there were no dentists, just broken molars and thicker soup. Let's pause a moment to reflect on how much effort went into a single loaf. First, grow the grain, then harvest it by hand. Dry it, thresh it, winnow it, grind it, and only then can you bake. And even then, it might not rise. It might turn sour. It might go moldy. It might be eaten by rats. And if it did survive, it was sliced with care, stored in a cloth, hidden from children, guarded from dogs, because bread was currency. Some peasants tried to stretch their bread by mixing in mash, the leftover grains from ale making. It made the loaf darker, bitter, but it was filling. Others soaked old bread in broth to make bread soup. Still others fried it in lard, when available, to make bread cakes. Every crumb was used. Every crust had purpose. Even the moldy ends were fed to animals or boiled to feed the desperate. You might wonder, was there ever sweetness? Ever pleasure? Yes, rarely. On feast days, families saved up to bake honey cakes, dense loaves sweetened with syrup or berries, a touch of cinnamon, if traded from the city, maybe a splash of ale in the dough. These were shared in slivers, eaten with reverence, and remembered for months. So next time you tear into soft, fluffy bread, consider this. A medieval peasant would not recognize it. It would feel impossible, magical, too white, too soft, too clean. Their bread was labor. Their bread was sacrifice. And most importantly, their bread was earned. Every loaf, a monument to survival. So no, peasants didn't eat crusty artisan loaves with golden cheese wedges. They ate black bread, flatbread, acorn cakes, rye mush, and still, they called it food. They called it enough. Because when you've worked all day in the field, when your hands are blistered, your back is bent, a single slice of something warm and solid is a miracle. And miracles, in the medieval world, didn't come in golden plates. They came in crumbs. Let's take a step away from the hearth now and into a broader truth. Because if we want to understand how medieval peasants ate, we have to understand what they couldn't eat. And at the top of that list was meat. We often think of meat as central to the medieval diet. Roasted boars at banquets, chickens turning over spits, sausages, haunches, stews thick with flavor. And that was true if you were wealthy. or royal or clergy. But for the peasant, meat was rare, a memory, a rumor, a whisper of taste. Not because they didn't want it, not because they didn't know how to cook it, but because they weren't allowed to have it, or simply couldn't afford it. You see, two great forces stood between the peasant and a bite of meat, the church and poverty. Let's start with the church. Medieval Christianity wasn't just a religion. It was a rule book, a calendar, a diet plan. The church dictated when and what you could eat, and meat was constantly off the table. Fridays, no meat. Lent, no meat. Advent, no meat. Fast days, no meat. And that wasn't once in a while. Historians estimate that up to 1/3 of the medieval year was meatless by mandate. But it wasn't just about meat. On fasting days, you also had to avoid eggs, cheese, milk, butter. Even lard was off limits, which meant, for many days of the year, the only thing left to eat was plants. Soups of onions and barley, bread dipped in vinegar, pottage without fat, gruel without joy. The church taught that abstaining from meat purified the soul, and for peasants, that meant their souls stayed very pure, because they were almost always abstaining. The irony, the nobility could buy indulgences. They could pay the church to overlook dietary sins. They could feast behind closed doors, while peasants boiled cabbage water. So fasting became another line drawn between rich and poor, another sermon you had to chew with your empty stomach. And then there was poverty. Let's talk about livestock. A pig was wealth. A cow was unimaginable wealth. A chicken was security. A goat was gold. Most peasants didn't own these animals. If they did, the animals were watched like treasure. You didn't eat your pig. You fed it scraps for months. And then, maybe at year's end, it was slaughtered and preserved for winter. The meat was salted, dried, smoked. Nothing wasted. The tail, the fat, the ears, the blood, everything used. And that meat was rationed. A piece here, a sliver there, bones for broth, fat for cooking. It could stretch for months. Sometimes the local lord took a share. Sometimes the church did. Sometimes it was stolen. So even when you had meat, you might not keep it. There were other sources, but they came with risk. Hunting in the Lord's forest, illegal, a rabbit caught in your snare. If discovered, you could lose a hand, or worse. Poaching was a crime, not because of cruelty, but because of class. Wild animals belonged to the nobility. A deer in the woods, that was the Lord's meat. A bird in the tree, that was the bishop's bird. A fish in the stream, that was the abbey's property. The peasant, he could starve next to a feast he wasn't allowed to touch. Still, they tried. They caught frogs from ponds, snared squirrels in the trees, gathered snails after rain. They fried beetles. They roasted hedgehogs. They boiled bones they found on the roadside. It wasn't appetizing. It wasn't noble, but it was meat. And sometimes that meant everything. Some villages gathered together for a pig kill. A single animal shared by 5 or 6 families, each portion carefully measured, each strip of fat packed in salt, each piece of offal stuffed with oats and herbs. It became black pudding, or blood sausage, or preserved slices hung in chimneys. These weren't treats, they were insurance. Meat wasn't for pleasure, it was for the next famine. And yes, they prayed, before killing, before storing, before eating. Because meat was sacred, because it came rarely, and because to waste it would be a sin. So when the church said no meat, peasants obeyed. Not just out of faith, but because they had no meat to begin with. This created a kind of irony, a paradox of hunger. The poor obeyed the church's dietary rules by default, while the rich sinned in secret behind locked doors. And yet the poor were told to be grateful, told that suffering was holy, that hunger was humility, that abstinence was a blessing. But it never felt like a blessing. It felt like emptiness, like tired arms and aching teeth, like scraping the bottom of the pot and finding nothing. Still, they survived. They adapted. They learned to live without. They turned lentils into stew. They flavored pottage with wild garlic. They thickened broth with oats. They boiled bones until they broke. And they passed down those recipes from mother to daughter, from grandmother to grandson, from one generation of hunger to the next. So when you hear someone say, medieval peasants ate like kings, remember this: they ate like survivors, like saints without choice, like people whose menus were carved by poverty and sanctified by the church. They didn't feast. They waited for spring, for harvest, for meat that might never come. And still, they lived. They endured, one spoonful of soup at a time. Let's imagine a different kind of evening now. One where the pot isn't half empty, but brimming, where the children are smiling, and something unusual is in the air. The smell of meat, because even in a life shaped by hunger, there were moments, brief, bright, unforgettable, when peasants feasted. Not often, not lavishly, but together. Feasts in the peasant world were rare, but when they happened, they were sacred, not in the way of kings and court banquets, with velvet tablecloths and glistening goblets. No, this was feasting in its purest form, earned, shared, and almost always homemade. A peasant feast might begin with a wedding, or a christening, or the end of harvest. Sometimes it was just a particularly good catch of fish, or a rabbit that wandered too far from the woods. And other times, it was death, a funeral, a goodbye, a reason to gather, to remember, and to eat. Because in hard times, any excuse to come together was sacred. The food, it depended on the season and the kindness of neighbors. Sometimes there was meat, salted pork, if it had been a good year, boiled chicken, if someone had spared a hen, or blood pudding, made fresh from a shared slaughter. But more often, the star of the table was a massive pot of pottage, richer than usual, thicker, creamier, enhanced with every ingredient the village could muster: leeks and lentils, onions and eggs, herbs and fat. It was the same dish they ate every day, but this time it was special, because it had flavor, because it was shared, because no one was turned away. Loaves of bread were brought from different homes, cracked, stale, warm, burnt. It didn't matter. They were stacked in baskets or spread on old cloth. There might be cheese, if someone had made it that week, soft, salty, spread on cabbage leaves, or crumbled into the stew. And there was almost always ale. Peasant ale was weak by today's standards. More of a thick, bready drink than a buzz, but it was fermented. It was warm, and it was enough to ease sore muscles and bring a little cheer. Children were given diluted ale, mixed with water, safer than the village well, which could be tainted, and elders, well, they drank deeply, because they'd seen enough winters to earn it. Entertainment came not from musicians, but from stories, tales of saints, tales of the old times, tales of things that never happened, but should have. Someone might have a flute or a pipe carved from bone. Someone else might bang a pot with a spoon and call it music. And for a few hours, life felt full. Laughter filled the air. Smoke curled lazily through the rafters. Dogs lay at the edge of the crowd, tails thumping, waiting for scraps. Sometimes there were songs, simple chants passed down for generations. No harmony, no written notes, just call and response, just rhythm, just people remembering how to be more than tired. There were no toasts, no speeches, but eyes met across the firelight. And in those glances was gratitude. You're still here. I'm still here. We made it another season. These feasts weren't about indulgence. They were about relief. A brief exhale in a life that rarely allowed it. They reminded peasants they were still human. Not just hands in the dirt, not just backs in the field, but people who could sit, share, smile, and taste joy. Leftovers were precious. Everything was packed away carefully. The bones were boiled again. The crumbs were dried and saved. Even the fat scraped from pots was stored in jars, because tomorrow it would be back to gruel, back to the thin soup, the black bread, the cabbage stew. But tonight, there was abundance. And even if it would pass, even if hunger waited just a sunrise away, this moment was theirs. And in that way, these secret feasts were acts of defiance. They said, I am more than my hunger. I am more than my Lord's taxes. I am more than the church's rules. I am still alive. And that was something worth celebrating. So when you imagine the medieval feast, don't picture castles and silver platters. Picture a smoky cottage, rough wooden bowls, bread passed by hand, children laughing with crusts in their fists, old men sipping warm ale with quiet smiles. And know this, for the peasant, a true feast wasn't measured in dishes, it was measured in moments. In the modern world, food is constant. You want strawberries in winter? They're flown in. Craving soup at midnight? Just open a can. Want bread, eggs, cheese? They wait patiently on a shelf. Always there. But in the world of the medieval peasant, food was never guaranteed. It came and it vanished with the seasons. Tonight, we walk through a year, a full cycle of hunger, hope, and hardship as seen through the peasant's plate. It begins in spring. Spring sounds like a time of abundance. But for the medieval peasant, spring was often a season of lean desperation. The stores from winter were nearly gone. The salted meat, eaten. The onions and beans, sprouting in their jars. The bread, stale or molding. The animals, thin, tired, not yet birthing. And the fields, just mud. The seeds had been planted, but the harvest was months away. So spring became a time of scouring, foraging for wild greens, digging up the last turnips, making soup from almost nothing, nettle soup, dandelion stew, boiled roots, leaves, and memory. Then came summer. Warmth returned. Crops grew. The gardens filled. This was a time of hope. Peas, beans, leeks, cabbages curling, apples ripening on the branch. But summer was also a gamble. Too much rain, crops drowned. Too little, they withered. A pest swarm, a blight, a fire, one misstep from nature, and the year's food was lost. So peasants watched the sky like scripture, prayed for balance, worked the fields from dawn to dusk, and when the harvest came, if it came, they moved into autumn. Autumn was the briefest taste of plenty. Grain was threshed, cabbage was pulled, beans were shelled, roots were dug, everything was gathered, stacked, hung, salted, dried, smoked, buried. Barrels were filled, lofts were packed, the pig was slaughtered, the onions braided, the cheese pressed, and for just a few weeks, the cottage felt full. There were meals with meat, thick pottage, fresh bread, apples and nuts, smiles. The children stopped asking for more, and the parents, quietly, made calculations. How long will this last? Can we stretch this ham to February? Will the beans rot? Is there enough salt for the cabbage? Because just behind autumn's shoulder came winter. Winter was not cold. It was hungry. The fires burned, but the pots grew thin. Every day became subtraction. One less onion, one less loaf, one less meal. The snow was not beautiful. It was a wall. It blocked the roads. It choked the garden. It silenced the woods. There was no foraging, no harvesting, only waiting. And if your calculations were wrong, if you celebrated too much in autumn, winter made you pay. Families rationed food like medicine. 1 bowl per person. No seconds. Watered down stew. Crusts softened in broth. Bones boiled again. Children grew thin. Old people grew silent. Mothers ate less, so their babies could eat more. The church might offer relief. A fish, a loaf, but only if the Lord allowed it. And if the frost stayed too long, famine knocked. The worst years are written in records. Years when the rains never stopped, when the fields turned to soup, when grain rotted in storage, when whole villages starved. They called it the Great Hunger. And it wasn't just 1 year. It happened again and again. Still, they survived because they had rhythms, wisdom, old tricks passed down from older mouths. How to store carrots in straw, how to trap a squirrel, how to dry mushrooms on twine, how to keep a family alive on soup and prayer. And they had hope that spring would come again, that the ground would thaw, that seeds would sprout, that food would return. A year of hunger was also a year of faith, in the land, in each other, in the next harvest. So when we speak of the peasant diet, we mustn't speak only of what they ate, but when. Because food was not just taste, it was time, a calendar made of hunger, a plate shaped by the moon, a life measured not in meals, but in seasons. Let's set the food aside for a moment and raise a cup. Because while medieval peasants may have lived with empty plates, their mugs were rarely dry. But what they drank might surprise you. It wasn't wine. It wasn't clean water. It wasn't even the strong ale we think of today. No, the drinks of the medieval peasant were humble, functional, medicinal, and sometimes strangely beautiful. Let's begin with the most important drink of all, ale. Not the dark, heady ale of taverns and nights, but a weak, cloudy, low-alcohol brew, made in the cottage hearth, often by women. They called it small ale, and it was everywhere. Why? Because water could kill you. Streams were easily tainted. Wells could be poisoned by runoff or decay. Rainwater was unreliable. Boiling water helped, but fermentation? That was safer. The process was simple. Grain, usually barley, was soaked, heated, and left to ferment with wild yeast. Sometimes herbs were added, sometimes fruit, sometimes just luck. It bubbled for a few days, was strained, and then consumed. Quickly, because it didn't keep. Small ale had little alcohol, maybe 1 or 2%, just enough to preserve it. Children drank it, pregnant women drank it. Old men sipped it from chipped clay mugs. It wasn't about intoxication, it was about hydration and calories. In a life of hard labor, a mug of thick ale gave you something the stew couldn't. Liquid sustenance. Brew days were community events. Fires were stoked, large kettles borrowed from neighbors. Grain was stirred with wooden paddles. Steam rose into the rafters. Women, often mothers, widows, or skilled housewives were the brewmasters. They passed down techniques, secrets, recipes adjusted by feel, not measurement. And when a batch turned out particularly good, neighbors came calling, a little bartering, a little laughter, maybe a celebration. Because in a dry, cold world, a warm cup could make the darkness feel distant. But ale wasn't the only thing peasants drank. They had herb infusions, broths, fermented milk, rainwater tea, boiled with leaves or roots. Many of these drinks were medicinal, made to soothe, to calm, to heal. Let's open an old wooden chest. Inside, bundles of dried plants. Chamomile for sleep, yarrow for fever, peppermint for belly aches, meadowsweet for pain. These herbs were steeped in water, sometimes ale, and given as tonics, often by women, the healers, midwives, and wise grandmothers who knew what the apothecary did not. One drink in particular held deep meaning. Wassail. It came during winter festivals. Spiced ale or cider, heated with apples and honey. It was shared with songs, with toasts to the orchard, with hopes for the year ahead. A sip for health, a sip for wealth, a sip for the apple trees. It was part drink, part prayer. There were stranger brews, too. Fermented birch sap, brine made from sour herbs, posset, a hot mix of milk and ale, curdled and sweetened. Caudle, a drink for the sick, made of spiced wine, eggs, and thickened with bread. Not all of it was pleasant. Some of it was gritty, slimy, bitter, but all of it had purpose. And that was the key. In a world without refrigeration, preservatives, or sanitation, a drink was more than a thirst quencher. It was a survival tool, a healer, a way to carry the seasons inside your cup. Drinks were also symbolic. A shared mug meant trust. A toast meant gratitude. A brew made for a neighbor meant alliance. A medicinal draught given freely meant mercy. To drink together was to remember your place in the village. Not alone, never alone. Let's go back now to the evening hearth. The children sleep. The fire glows softly. And two parents sit, each with a steaming mug of weak ale. They don't speak. They don't need to. They sip slowly and feel the warmth of the brew, fill the cold corners of their tired bodies. They know the ale isn't strong, but it is theirs, made with their grain, boiled in their pot, shared between them. And in that sip, there is comfort, not intoxication, not escape, just a moment of calm. Not everything that grew was gathered. Not everything that moved was hunted. And not everything that could be eaten was eaten. Because for the medieval peasant, food wasn't just survival, it was belief. And some foods carried weight beyond the stomach. They carried stories, warnings, superstitions. Tonight, let's walk the darker edge of the peasant diet. The things they would not touch. The things whispered about over stew. The things believed to bring sickness or sin. We begin with the woods. The medieval forest was both pantry and portal. It gave life, berries, mushrooms, rabbits, but it also concealed danger. And so, among the edible treasures were many things feared. Take mushrooms. They were gathered, yes, but with caution, with deep knowledge, and with fear. One wrong mushroom could kill you in hours. A twisted cap, a bitter stem, a slimy underside. So the knowledge of which ones were safe was passed on, whispered between generations, never written down. Gatherers learned by watching. And even then, they tested, with fingertips, with the smell. Some even fed small amounts to dogs first, and watched. Then there were plants. Many were helpful, but others, they carried names that chilled the spine. Hemlock, belladonna, nightshade. These weren't food. They were curses. Even the name nightshade sounded like a warning in the dark. These plants weren't just avoided for safety. They were believed to be witches' tools, instruments of poison, used in potions, whispered about in dreams. No peasant mother would let her child near them. And if a goat died in the field after eating leaves, the culprit was known, not just the plant, but the spirit behind it. But fear didn't stop with wild plants. It entered the kitchen. There were rules about what could be combined, what could be eaten together, what must never share the same plate. Fish and milk, for example, believed to cause disease if consumed at the same time. Fruit and meat, too rich, too dangerous, and if someone fell ill after a strange meal, the food was not just blamed, it was feared. The stew was cursed, the bread was bewitched, the cheese was turned. Fermented food, especially, sat on the edge of acceptance. They used it, relied on it, but they also watched it carefully. Because when something bubbles, grows mold, changes color, it begins to look alive. And in a world of spirits and saints, something alive in the wrong way was suspicious. So they prayed over their barrels of ale, marked their cheese with holy signs, hung herbs above storage jars. Protection wasn't just for the soul, it was for the pantry. There were animals too, feared, hated, untouched. Cats, of course, were rarely eaten, seen as magical, mysterious, sometimes demonic. Toads were worse. Their presence in a garden could mean fertility, or a witch's blessing, or both. And rats. Well, rats were not feared for what they were, but for what they carried. Their appearance signaled plague. Their bites brought fever. Their bodies, when found in the grain, were burned. And yet, in the direst of times, even these rules could bend. During the worst famines, peasants did what they never thought possible. There are records, terrible, heartbreaking records, of people eating things they once believed to be cursed. Grass, boiled leather, rotten roots, even the bark of trees, even clay. But these acts were not forgotten. They were remembered, with shame, with silence. After the famine ended, those who survived went back to their taboos, even if it meant hunger, even if they knew better, because belief was stronger than reason. And then there was salt. Salt was life. Salt preserved. Salt healed. But too much salt? That was evil. If a pot boiled dry and the salt blackened, it was a sign, a bad omen. Some even said it meant someone in the house would die that winter. And so, salt was respected, measured, blessed. Let's return now to the hearth. A woman stirs a pot. She's added nettles, leeks, beans, but she stops before adding garlic. Why? Because her mother once said not to use garlic after dusk. It keeps the good spirits away. It doesn't matter if it's true. It's believed, and belief is half the meal. So when we imagine the peasant table, we must imagine not just what is present, but what is missing. The foods not eaten, the flavors avoided, the wild things left untouched. Not out of ignorance, not out of superstition alone, but out of a deep generational understanding that food is not just nourishment, it is ritual, it is story, it is power, and some power is best left untouched. Let's walk, not into the kitchen, but into the field, because before the pot, before the bowl, before the fire, there was the soil, and for medieval peasants, this was where everything began. They didn't shop, they didn't order, they didn't store aisles of packaged food behind locked doors. No, they grew what they could, they foraged what they found, and they prayed that the earth would answer. The fields were vast, but not owned by the peasants. They worked them, but the land belonged to the Lord. Most peasants were serfs, tied to the manor, required to plow, sow, and harvest crops that they would never own. But each family had a small plot, a few strips of land in the open field system, long, narrow, and precious. This was for them, for survival. They planted grains, barley, rye, oats, wheat, when they could afford it. Wheat was harder to grow, needed better soil, often saved for the Lord. The rest, that was the peasant's lifeline. Planting was done by hand. No machines, no modern plows. They walked the rows with seed pouches, cast grain with wide sweeping gestures, turned the earth with heavy wooden tools. And then they waited. They watched the sky, prayed for rain, feared frost, because if the weather failed, the food failed. When the harvest finally came, it wasn't a celebration. It was a race against rot, against weather, against the birds, the mice, the mold. They cut stalks with scythes, bundled them into sheaves, carried them by cart if they had one, on backs if they didn't. Then came the threshing, beating the grain to loosen the seed, then the winnowing, tossing it into the air so the wind could carry away the chaff. This was done in the open, in dust, in sweat, in hope. Once gathered, the grain had to be stored, but storage was dangerous. If the bags were too damp, mold. If they weren't sealed, mice. If there was too much, the Lord might take more. So grain was hidden, in barrels, in pits, in lofts beneath the roof beams. Women checked for moisture daily. Men patched holes, chewed by rats. Children were taught to listen for the tiny scratching of vermin. It wasn't a nuisance. It was a threat to the winter supply. Other food was preserved differently. Onions and garlic were braided and hung. Beans were dried and stored in clay jars. Carrots and turnips were buried in pits, layered with straw. Cabbage was pickled. Milk became cheese. Meat, when available, was salted and smoked. Everything had a technique, passed down from mouth to hand, not for flavor, but for survival. And then there was cooking. The hearth was the heart of the peasant home. Not a stove, not a range, a fire built in a stone or clay nook, smoke escaping through a hole in the roof. A pot, heavy, blackened, suspended over the coals. A few clay dishes, a wooden spoon, maybe two. No forks, rarely a knife. The food was boiled, always boiled. Boiling softened everything, made it stretch, made it safer. Frying required oil, roasting required luxury, baking required an oven. So boiling was the language of poverty. Bread was baked once a week, often in a communal oven. Dough was marked with symbols, a cross, a family sign, so you could find your loaf again. Ashes blackened the crust. Smoke flavored the inside. The bread was hard, but it was there. There were few tools, no timers, no thermometers, only instinct. Listen to the pot, feel the dough, smell the fire. Cooking wasn't precise, it was intuitive, an art born of repetition and ritual, and yet there was care. Food wasn't beautiful, but it was loved. A mother scraping the bottom of the pot for the last scoop, not for herself, but for her child. A father cutting the bread into even pieces, though he wanted more. A grandmother blowing on a wooden spoon, testing for heat and hope. So from field to fire, food was never simple. It was planted with aching backs, stored with anxious hearts, cooked with tired hands, served with quiet dignity, and always, always, it was earned. Next time you stir a pot, open a bag of rice, break a piece of bread. Remember this, for the medieval peasant, every bite was a season, a tool, a prayer, a story. Food was not just what they ate, it was who they were. Tonight, we step into a quieter room, a room with a single bed, a candle flickering low, and a hush that only comes when something is ending. Because as much as food marked life, it also marked death. And the final meals of medieval peasants, though simple, though silent, were filled with meaning. Death was not a surprise in the medieval world. It came early, it came often, and it came slowly. Sometimes after illness, sometimes after childbirth, sometimes after years of slow hunger that simply wore the body away. And when it came, the table changed. The dying were not isolated. They remained in the home, in the same space where the children played, where the soup bubbled, where the bread was broken. There was no hospital, no separation. The body stayed in the house until the soul moved on, and so the final meal was often served just feet from where it would be remembered. If a person could eat, they were given soft foods. Pottage thinned with water, a slice of bread soaked in broth, a sip of weak ale. There was no wine, no ceremony, no feast, but every bite was watched, every swallow a sign. Were they strong enough? Were they slipping? And when the appetite faded, it was understood. The end was near. In those final hours, the family prepared what they could. If the church permitted, a priest was called to administer last rites. Holy water was sprinkled, a candle placed at the bedside, and sometimes, if the dying could still speak, they asked for one last taste, not of food, but of something more. A bit of honey on the tongue, a sip of ale warmed by the fire, a piece of blessed bread, broken by hand and placed gently on the lips, not swallowed, just touched, a reminder that even in death, they were still a part of the table. After the passing, the home changed. Windows were opened, even in winter, to let the soul leave. Mirrors were covered, if any existed, to keep the spirit from lingering. The body was washed, wrapped, watched, and in some villages, a final meal was prepared, not for the dead, but for the living, to mourn. These mourning meals were called arvels in parts of England. Elsewhere, simply funeral feasts. They were quiet, not joyous, not lavish, but they were meaningful. Neighbors brought bread, pottage, eggs, if they could spare them. Sometimes meat, as a gesture of deep respect. And the community gathered, not just to grieve, but to share. because grief, like hunger, was too heavy to carry alone. Children might not fully understand, but they remembered. The warm bowls passed hand to hand, the smell of soup in the air, the low, steady voices of the elders speaking gently over food. These meals became memories. A soft crust of bread, eaten beside tears. A ladle of soup that soothed a hollow heart. A shared silence, filled only by chewing. The dead were not spoken of in grand ways. Not with poems, not with statues, but they were remembered at the table. On certain feast days, a plate might be placed for them. Their favorite herb added to the stew. Their seat left empty, but not forgotten. And life went on. The pot was scrubbed, the fire relit, the grain ground again. Children still needed feeding. Fields still needed tending. But something stayed. The final meal lingered. Like steam after a pot is taken off the fire. Soft, fading, present. Because in the world of medieval peasants, death wasn't the end of hunger. It was a new silence at the table, a missing spoon, a memory that lived in pottage and prayer. So when we speak of what peasants ate, we must include this. They ate in mourning. They ate through loss. And they fed each other not just with food, but with presence. A hand on the shoulder, a ladle of broth, a bowl set gently before a trembling heart. This too was part of the menu. And if there was one truth they understood more than any other, it was this. Life is a passing meal. What matters is how you share it. Now that the pot is empty, and the fire has burned low, we sit in silence, not of absence, but of fullness. We've traveled far tonight, not through grand halls or golden feasts, not with kings or knights, but with those history often forgets, the peasants, the laborers, the hungry, the steady hands behind the bread you never noticed. We've sat beside their hearths, we've stirred their pottage, we've knelt in their gardens, we've carried their harvests, watched their winters, tasted their grief, and through it all, one truth has echoed beneath every chapter. They endured, despite the cold, despite the rules, despite the hunger that came and came again. They endured. Because food, for them, was never just food. It was hope in a bowl, love in a ladle, memory in a slice of dark bread. They fed their children before themselves. They stretched a bone into broth. They sang over stews that had no meat. And somehow, they still smiled. Not always, not often, but they did. We live in a world now of choice. Pantries filled with items we forget we bought, waste we never notice, flavors we take for granted, but the medieval peasant lived differently. Each bite mattered. Each season shaped their meals. Each neighbor influenced what was shared. Food wasn't just survival. It was ritual. It was identity. And sometimes, it was grace. So what can we learn as we drift off to sleep? Maybe this. That hunger is not just physical. It's also a longing for connection, for warmth, for safety, for enough. And in their way, peasants knew how to feed more than their bodies. They fed each other's spirit, with stories, with a spoon passed hand to hand, with a pot that never stopped simmering, even when the cupboard was bare. And maybe that's what still draws us to them, not their suffering, but their softness, their quiet humanity. A woman blowing on a spoon before feeding a child. A man breaking bread and saving the last piece for his neighbor. A garden dug with aching hands because there might still be a meal in the dirt. They lived without plenty, but not without dignity. And somehow, that still feeds us now. So as you lay your head down tonight, let their rhythm soften yours. Let the pot simmer slowly in your thoughts. Let the barley swell. Let the fire crackle. Let the hunger that once lived in history remind you to taste your own life more fully, to chew slowly, to share generously, to be grateful, not just for what's on your plate, but for who's beside you. Because even in the smallest cottage, even in the poorest village, even in the darkest winter, there was always a seat at the fire, and always a spoon waiting to be shared. Good night, and may your dreams be warm, full, and gently stirred by the hands of history.